And welcome to another live here at the Marshals Museum. We are on the banks of the Arkansas River, Fort Smith, Arkansas, and we are here to do another Friday Live. We've switched them over from every week on Facebook over to once a month over on YouTube. Just, we kind of feel it's better that way. So we are going to go ahead and talk today. There's been an amazing, just really fun timing with this, that great film just dropped online. I've already talked to a couple of friends of mine. They kind of disagree with me, but I really enjoyed it as a Western. The movie's The Harder They Fall. As we talked about it, I'm going to be talking today about the film The Harder They Fall. And I'm going to talk about the people who are in it, the various characters, maybe what the director was trying to do with it, a couple other things, not as much about a movie review, although you'll tell by the end of it that I really, really enjoyed the film, but also talking a lot about fact or fiction, how much of it was real, how much of it was fake, how close the director hit to the real people. And I think, I don't know, I had a lot of fun watching it. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but I think it's going to be we're going to have a good conversation here. If you are interested in talking about this, if you've got any questions about everything, go ahead and throw a comment down below and we'll keep track of those, and I'll try to answer some of those as I can as we go through this. Let's go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and just kind of start jumping into this. But before we go any further, I just want to thank you all for dropping in, taking time out of your day to hang out with the Marshals Museum. We're here in Fort Smith, Arkansas. If this is your first time here, please make sure you like us. Go ahead and click on the bell if you want to make sure you catch everything that we're doing. We've got some stuff here. A lot of our stuff's already been over on Facebook, but we're moving it over slowly but surely. But we've got a ton of content that we've already provided here. We're about ready to drop some more from our current lecture series about the 20th anniversary of 9/11. You can stop by our webpage and hit our museum store. You can find out more about our progress as we get ready to open. And we are looking at an open date sometime in the back end of 2022. So we're just about a year out. We are talking to our production company and making sure that we're going to be able to start moving forwards. So we'll be really looking forward to telling this story about 230 years of our country, of the United States Marshals, and kind of making that real for you. So let's go ahead and jump into The Harder They Fall, Marshal Myths, Fact or Fiction. And so I want to give a little bit of an overview first about the movie. I have to warn you right now, there will be spoilers. There's going to be stuff we're going to talk about. If you haven't seen the film yet, I'm not going to try and give away too much stuff, but there's going to be some stuff in here that you're going to hear that if you may or may not be a spoiler for the show. Part of a Western, and especially in this case, it's kind of hard to try to figure out where and when it is, but I think that's kind of the idea. This movie was kind of placed in the nebulous West, like the big capital W West. And so when we're looking at this, I'm going to go ahead and I'm playing around a little bit with some of the stuff. When is the West? The West that we're talking about, I want to time it down to kind of figuring out how to get there. The guns, mostly Winchester 1873s, Colt single actions. So they really were the guns that won the West. They were the most popular guns for most people. However, by the end of the 19th century, you have Smith & Wesson's double-action revolvers start to take over Colts. And a lot of people really started to carry those, but that's a whole gun nerd thing, and we're not going to dive into that right now. We also see a lot of Winchester 1886s. So with that, that automatically makes us at least 1886. There's a lot of hammer side-by-side shotguns, a lot of Springfield rifles, commonly called a trapdoor. With that stuff, that helps date it. We know it's at least 1873, but really you're looking at the 1880s, 1890s for a lot of this stuff. The thing that caught me off guard is there are a couple of scenes where you see, well, the main bad guy, Rufus Buck, he's carrying a pair of gold-plated Remington single-action revolvers, which I thought that was a neat twist. Normally they're all carrying Colts, but they really wanted to give him something different, it looks like, so they gave him something different. You don't usually see Remington single-actions. I saw a Smith & Wesson #3 at least in one scene where you see the guy flipping the gun open so he can eject the cartridges and load them quickly. And then the thing that boggled my mind is there's a scene where Rufus Buck is being freed on the train, and one of his guys in his gang is carrying a Colt Walker. That's a revolver from the 1840s that was never really used much beyond that, for a number of reasons. I was really surprised to see that. The clothes, men's and women's fashions from the late 1800s. Based on some of that, and especially trying to get all the characters to be alive at the same time, I ended up kind of picking for a time frame of when this is supposed to go, 1895-ish. You're going to hear ish a lot here, not necessarily ish in the slang term, but ish because we're not quite sure, because again, this is the Old West-ish. It's kind of like the film Silverado. You don't quite know when it takes place. Some of the stuff that's there, and regarding firearms, there's a couple of times you see Winchester 1866s. You wouldn't have seen those after the 1870s or especially into the 1880s. So by the 1890s, you wouldn't have seen those. You wouldn't have seen a Colt Walker, but yet you know that you've got at least the Winchester 1886s limits it to after that. But the clothes and trying to get all the people, especially the two main bad guys. But the other question is, where is this? And a lot of us, it's coming from the world of academic history. We're trying to figure out a lot of times where stuff takes place. And when you start to ask people, what's the West, when you start talking in your mind? And when you're talking about a lot of this stuff, you are having to, I'm just like going through some of those clues. When we start talking about where's the West, what's the West, you are looking a lot of the time at trying to figure out what is it in your mind. Are you picturing saguaro cactus? Are you picturing just tumbling tumbleweeds? Are you picturing Rocky Mountains? Are you picturing lots of, just depending on what you're looking at, the time frame, the location, there are a lot of different things that people get as mental images. So I really wanted to kind of figure out where this is located at. Most of the characters are tied to in real life. These are like really real people. Most of them were tied to Texas, Indian Territory. Some of them were tied to Fort Smith specifically. A lot of these folks were tied to other places. Kansas. Nat Love and Stagecoach Mary were both born in real life in Tennessee. Both of them born into slavery. You have some people that spent time in Arizona, Colorado, California. So they're all over the place. But a lot of this kind of ties to Texas, Indian Territory, that area. And when you start to look into this even further, Bass mentions at one point, talking after he gets caught up with Nat, talks about taking him back to Fort Smith. So are they in Indian Territory at that point? And if they're in Indian Territory at some point, it's completely devoid of Choctaw, Muskogee, Cherokee, any other Indians other than just the main characters who would have in real life been either a member of one of the Five Nations or Cherokee freedmen, Creek freedmen, things like that. One of the things I really liked in here was the fact that you have these all black towns or all white towns. This is a part of history that a lot of people don't really get a chance to look at. A lot of people don't understand that there is a huge gap in where people could live during the time frame after the Civil War. So after the American Civil War, up through up through the 20s, 30s, 40s, the 20th century, you have a lot of towns where they're either the sundown towns, the white towns where you can't be there after sundown if you're not white, or you have the black towns, towns populated entirely by black Americans, many times former enslaved people, many times people who were not allowed to live anywhere else. So you have these towns stretched all over the country. And I've had conversations with people who don't understand how widespread these are, and they were surprised that I said it was true that you would get towns as successful as what is shown here. As an example, I'll always give, even though it's kind of the section of town, if you ever hear about the Tulsa race violence that took place, a lot of people made a big deal about that, how that showed up in a couple of different TV series over the course of this last year or so. That wiped out essentially Black Wall Street in the city of Tulsa, in that section of town where the black population was allowed to live. There were some very wealthy people in that area, in a lot of the towns that had just solely black American population. They had huge businesses. They had lots of stuff going on that was no different than what you would see in a white town. I think there's a lot of people who have kind of maybe a racist view of the history that, oh, they just would have been living in shacks. Like, no, they had the same stuff everybody else did. So I think they really hit that town. I think that was a really great example of what was on there. As part of all of this as well, a lot of the town name cards, they occasionally reference Texas. So I would definitely go with Texas is where it's located. As to the subject of the black towns, well, and then before we get into that, talking about the idea of the West. And when we're talking about the West, we're talking about there's a lot of towns would be very homogenous populations. Everybody would be, it's like you would either have one group of people, or you would have one group of people and then a small enclave, whether it was black, Chinese, Hispanic, or Latino. You would have different types of folks. One of my favorite examples, the town of Red Lodge, Montana, was a coal mining town, just southwest between Billings, Montana, and Yellowstone National Park. Awesome city, awesome town if you get a chance to go. During the first half of the 20th century, it was broken up into the section of town where the Finns lived, where the Italians lived, where the British lived, where just each of the different nationalities. You had a town, Silesia, up the road. That was where a lot of Polish immigrants lived. And so everybody had their own little areas. And as you started, you would live with people like you. And so we get a lot of this across the American West. You also have a lot of obvious, again, back to being a Western. You have a lot of good guys and bad guys. You have very much, in here, we're no longer in the 1950s or 60s. They're no longer wearing white hats and black hats to let you know what they are. But just how they act is pretty obvious, who they are, what they're doing. But even the good guys aren't always 100% good. Obviously, Old West, horses, trains, shootouts, saloons. And so it's more the same. It's not too far off. I know he starts to, some of the things that make this different from other Western films, very obviously the music, the language, how they act towards each other sometimes. There's a lot of things that kind of take you out of the moment. If you're looking for a pure Western, this is not a pure Western. But that's kind of like the TV series Firefly. To my mind, Firefly is a Western. It's in space. So, I mean, it's just, there's a lot of different things like that. You can take a Western and take it out of the West, and you can get that. You can change elements of it and still have it as a Western. So some of the influences to this, very quickly, as soon as you start watching it, obviously spaghetti Westerns, Quentin Tarantino, even video games, huge Red Dead Redemption player, you start to look at some of the things that go on in those games and some of those things that happen in these different movies. You'll see these set pieces in this film. Speaking of this film, the director, James Samuel, which a lot of people don't realize, James Samuel is the younger brother of the singer Seal. His previous short film, They Die by Dawn, many of the same characters, again, in a historic black town in Oklahoma, Langston. There's been a university in Langston's historical black college university for many, many years, since about the turn of the 1900s. And so Langston is the town where that takes place. And you have many of the same characters with the exception of Cherokee Bill and Rufus Buck. And so it's a really neat way that he's trying to tell these stories and he's trying to make these real. And I think he really nails it with his first two title cards that you see. And I made up these title cards because I couldn't get them screen capped because of how YouTube does their thing. But while the events of this story are fictional, these people existed. And I think that right there really does hit. Why did he make these films? Why is he telling these stories? It's because so much of this story has been, I wouldn't say erased, but very definitely whitewashed. It's been very much, you look through the history of any of this through the 1800s and into the 1900s, and the stories of Black America, the stories of tribal America, the stories of Latino America, is just they're ignored. And it really wasn't until the really in academia, the 1960s, in popular culture, the 70s, 80s, and especially into the 90s, you start to learn that there are all of these other stories that took place. And I think it's great that he's able to tell these stories and he's able to get this information out in a way that, even though it's fictional, and he quickly acknowledges it's fictional and all of the action is so over the top, it's got to be fictional, that he wants you to know that these people were here and these stories happened, and this is not something to be ignored. And if the people watching this are confused by who these people are, they want to know more, and they start out at Wikipedia, they go to books like Art Burton's Black, Red, and Deadly. Let me get this so you guys can see it. Black, Red, and Deadly by Art Burton. There's tons of stories about people of color, both sides of the law. Cowboys, deputies, lawmen, desperados, bad guys. You'll hear about some of the names that are in this film. And the character of Bass Reeves, let me come back here. If you want to learn more about Bass Reeves in particular, and I'll talk about Bass in a bit, you've got Black Gun, Silver Star, also by Art Burton. That's the place you want to start with either of those. But really, honestly, if you want to learn more about some of these folks, and I'll talk about them here for a bit, but jump onto Wikipedia, find out a little bit about them, get a rough idea of who they are, and then start reading up on them. As much as people make fun of Wikipedia, most of what is on Wikipedia has decent sources. And if it goes to a hardcover book that is on Amazon someplace, go after it. Have in the library loan, grab it. And you can learn more about these people and learn more about their stories in order to better understand what this film is about and why this film is here. And to the subject of all black towns, this is a map provided by Oklahoma Historical Society. All of the gray dots, let me blow this up for you. All the gray dots on here are historic towns and settlements that were all black towns. The ones that are orange are towns that still exist. And you'll see there's a lot of places, most of the east half of that map is Indian territory. The west half of the map, including Langston and Brooksville, that's Oklahoma territory. The one we also have as we go through here is another map. This is from Texas. In Texas, I think this might be Texas Tech, I think, is the school where this was done. Texas Freedom Colonies Atlas. And if you just Google Texas Freedom Colonies Atlas, you'll find that. And you can see how, especially through the east half of the map, there are cities all over the place. In Texas alone, there are over 300 known locations of cities and more than 500 place names that they know of, just places that they haven't found yet, because a lot of these places, they might have been just a small town that existed for a while and then went away or got bought out and plowed under. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of different ways that this happened. But really, there's some amazing stories that are out there. And I think that's one of the great things that the director is doing. He directed, wrote it, wrote the screenplay on this, is he's getting a chance to tell these stories of people whose stories have not been told or whose stories have been forgotten. And so let's get into who those people are and how he's telling those stories. So I want to talk a little bit about the cast. We've got Jonathan Majors as Nat Love. Just to give you, and I'll talk a little bit more about the characters here in a second. You've got Idris Elba as Rufus Buck. Rufus Buck is probably the single worst person that I've come across in the American West, in a surprisingly short-lived time frame. We have Zazie Beetz as Stagecoach Mary. Quite a bit, you'll see, she's quite a bit different than the real Stagecoach Mary. Delroy Lindo as Bass Reeves. My personal belief is that Delroy Lindo is the single best actor to ever play Bass Reeves. I've seen a number of people play at Bass Reeves. Delroy Lindo, I felt, just nailed it. If I ever had the chance to meet him and shake his hand as Bass Reeves, I could leave my job happily. Lakeith Stanfield as Cherokee Bill. R.J. Seiler as Jim Beckworth, which is just the fact that Jim Beckworth is in this film, mind-boggling, but we'll get there. Edie Gathegi, and I apologize to him profusely because I know I'm pronouncing his name wrong, as Bill Pickett. So the characters that the person that I did not realize until literally a half hour before I started doing this is the character of Cuffy is based on Cathay Williams, who was a real person, who was a woman a black woman who born into slavery, enlisted into the Union Army during the Civil War, fought in the Civil War, stayed in an infantry unit, and then ended up finally being found out as a woman. And I mean, just amazing story in her own right, but nobody's really made much of a play about how she's based on a real person. And so I'll talk a little bit about her later, but not as much as I would really have liked to. But that was Danielle Deadweiler who plays her. The characters they played, and again, these are all real characters. Nat Love, born 1854 into slavery in Tennessee. The actor who plays him, Jonathan Majors, as in 1895, and again, picking 1895 is just the idea of what year this started during this film. Nat Love would have been 41. The actor is 32. They're not far off. That's about one of the closest ones I've seen going across this list that you'll hear. Born in Tennessee, lived in Kansas, lived in Arizona, went up to South Dakota where he ended up getting involved with some different folks up there, got the nickname Deadwood Dick. Moves out to California in 1907, has a book published with essentially his autobiography. Unfortunately, thanks to just kind of how a lot of the autobiographies that were written around that time frame of Old West personas, there's some question as to how much is real, how much is not real, how much was made up by the author, how much was kind of blown out of proportion. But regardless, Nat Love was a legit cowboy. He was a legit woodsman. He was just like, he went out and he did his thing, was able to, he actually went out and did his stuff. He got involved in some gunfights, but he was not a gunfighter. He was not a bad man. He was not a criminal like what they show here. So he was living on both sides of the law. And so for a little bit of that, let me keep forgetting to transition back over so you guys get a chance to see this. But he ended up passing away in 1921 in Los Angeles. You'll find a number of these folks, they just lived their long life. But yeah, in 95, he would have been 41 years old. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about Rufus Buck. Played here by Idris Elba. Rufus Buck was born in 1878. In 1895, about the time that this photograph was taken, he was 17. Idris Elba, 49 years old. So, yeah. Odd casting, but you know what? I kind of get what they were doing. They needed a heavy. They needed the leader of the bad guys, and you can't have a 17-year-old who's the leader of the bad guys. But the crazy stuff about Rufus Buck is, okay, so he's born in Creek Nation in 1878. He's the tribal nation he's part of is the Uchi Indians. They were kind of organized, brought into the Muskogee Nation. Muskogee also people refer to as Creek. Hung out, did some time. He and some of his guys he knew, they spent some time in jail. They did some minor crimes. But what really kind of went sideways for them was they formed up as a gang, and starting on July 30th, 1895, they killed Deputy Marshal John Garrett, black deputy, one of the many black deputies working out of Fort Smith. This whole group, they were all Cherokee freedmen, Creek freedmen, which means that they were former children of former slaves of the members of the Creek Nation, or they were Creek themselves. They were basically robbing, raping, and killing for about a week and a half. That's what it was. A lot of people make a big deal of the Rufus Buck gang, but they were only really doing this for about 10 days. They get captured by Deputy US Marshals and Muskogee Nation Light Horse, the law enforcement for the tribe. And they're taken to Fort Smith. They're tried. I think the trial lasted all of 3 days. They were tried only for the charges of rape. And as part of those rape charges, they were given the death sentence, and then they were hanged on July 1st, 1896. So it was like these are, to my mind, some of the single worst people that you come across. Basically a bunch of 16, 17, 18, 19-year-olds who decided they were going to go around and just live that life. And I can't understand what or why they were doing this, but they were doing it. Stagecoach Mary. There's a big contrast here. I get what the director was doing. But at the time that this was happening, Stagecoach Mary would have been 63 in 1895. Zazie Beetz is 30, young enough to be Stagecoach Mary's daughter, if Stagecoach Mary would have ever had any children. Stagecoach Mary, she was, as with Nat, she was born into Tennessee, into slavery. 1832, after the Civil War, she's freed, works on the Mississippi Riverboat, ends up in Ohio. And while she's in Ohio, she's working for a man whose sister is a mother superior at a convent. And that mother superior kind of takes her in. She starts working there. They end up moving. She ends up going up to the mother superior goes to Montana. Stagecoach Mary follows her up to Montana. And as they do that, she ends up kind of falling out with the nunnery in Montana, well, and at the church school that Mother Superior is at. Ends up kind of just leaves the school, starts a tavern which doesn't do well, and then takes on, at the age of 60, a contract to carry mail. And she becomes the first black woman to carry mail for a contract in the United States. And so she does that for most of 10 years, ends up finally passing away. And she was living in, had to remind myself here, Cascade, Montana, up on what's now called the High Line. She's up in Cascade, Montana, and passes away in Great Falls, and she's buried up there. And every year, I guess to this day, they still have a day for Stagecoach Mary. But really an amazing person in her own right. If she were in this film as herself, though, she'd been 63, not 30. Cherokee Bill, one of my favorite people from the Old West, one of my favorite bad guys anyway. Cherokee Bill, by all rights, was a pretty popular guy. Just so you can get a little bit better idea of the difference between Cherokee Bill and Lakeith Stanfield, who plays him. Cherokee Bill, he was another kid. He was born in Texas, actually, to a soldier who was a Buffalo soldier, and to his mom was a Cherokee freedman, and so which means she was a former slave of person in the Cherokee tribe, Cherokee Nation. He goes through his life. He lives in Texas and Oklahoma, what's now Oklahoma, and Kansas. Spends a few years back east at a church school in Pennsylvania. Comes back out west after a few years and starts to hang out with the wrong crowd, starts to get into trouble, and then eventually starts getting into more serious trouble with the law. Starting in 1894, he ends up meeting up with the Cook brothers. They form the Cook gang, and they start rampaging around the area for a couple of years. They kill some law enforcement. They start robbing banks. They start killing other people as they're performing their robberies. And he gets captured finally. And in 1895, and he's hanged on March 17th, 1896. So what this means is with the time that he was in jail, because he was in jail in Fort Smith, here at the federal jail, same time as Isaac Parker was here, both Cherokee Bill and the Rufus Buck gang, they were both tried by Isaac Parker as the judge. And true to his nickname, they're all sentenced to hanging. Rufus Buck gang for rape, Cherokee Bill for murder. Cherokee Bill actually has an escape attempt while he is in jail. And as part of that escape attempt, he ends up killing one of his jailers. So we have that individual listed here in our Hall of Honor as someone who died in the line of duty to the Marshals. But he ends up, at that same time that that's happening, it wasn't until I was researching all of this, it finally hit me that Cherokee Bill and the Rufus Buck gang were all in the Fort Smith Federal Jail at the same time. They would have all been in different cells, but they probably talked. They probably had a chance to kind of get to know each other a little bit. So I would love to go into that. I'm sure you could make up a whole movie just about that several months that they were all in the same building. And let's see here. So Bass Reeves. What to say about Bass Reeves? Bass Reeves, the most prolific law enforcement officer this country has ever seen. Born into slavery, 1838, played here by Delroy Lindo. Bass Reeves, at the time that this film would have been going on, would have been 57. Delroy Lindo right now is 68. And so that's the only person who's in this film who's being played by somebody older than the real person. Actually, I'm sorry, really, like at that point, both Rufus Buck and Cherokee Bill, they're both played by folks who are older or much older. But yeah, Bass Reeves, really just an impressive character in real life. Worked for about 30 years within the U.S. Marshals as posse member, as a Deputy US Marshal. Worked across 3 different districts between the Western District of Arkansas here in Fort Smith, out of Paris, Texas, going up into Choctaw Nation, or towards the end of his career in Muskogee as part of Indian Territory. There's a whole lot more that we talk about Bass Reeves on some of our other videos. If you go take a look at our Facebook page, you can really catch a lot of information about Bass. The one thing that I want to make sure that you understand, though, is that by the time everything got said and done, his story had nothing to do with the creation of the character, the Lone Ranger. Anybody who knows me and they hear me talk about Bass Reeves they all know it's a sore spot with me. So, but yeah, Bass Reeves was really an impressive figure and really just an amazing person. And so deep of character that I would love to get more research done on him. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if you want to read more on Bass Reeves, this is where you start. Art Burton's Black Gun, Silver Star. That book is really kind of the Bible. But what you have to do is go through there, and there's a couple of stories that you have to kind of figure out what's true and what's not true. And I go into that in some of our other videos that we've had online, whether here on YouTube or over on our Facebook page. And very definitely, if you get the chance to go to our Facebook page, go ahead and head over to that at some point. Just go over to Facebook, search for US Marshals Museum. We have a whole collection of video files, all related to just different subjects on Marshals history. Bass Reeves is in just a bunch of them. Jim Beckwourth. This one always kind of caught my attention while I was watching the film, partially because Jim Beckwourth was dead by this point. Jim Beckwourth, he was born in 1798. He was born in the 18th century, maybe 1800, but he was born in the 18th century. He died in 1866. He was all over the West as a cowboy, as a trailblazer, lived amongst the Crow Indians for 9 or 10 years. Was married to the daughter of a chief, ended up just all over the American West after he got his freedom very early in his life. He was 16, was apprenticed out to become a blacksmith. That didn't work for him, and then so he just went west. He was a trader, he was a trapper, broke trails across into California during the gold rush. I mean, it's just really amazing all of the stuff Jim Beckwourth did, and we don't know any, he's not a more popular figure in American history with everything that he did and all the things he was part of. So by the time that this story took place in 1895, Jim Beckwourth would have been about 97 if he had still been alive. Unfortunately, he wasn't. He's played in this film by R.J. Seiler, 26-year-old. Little bit of an age difference, but I really enjoyed seeing how R.J. Seiler played the character. It was a lot of fun. It's one of those complaints I know some people have, is it takes you out of the moment, it takes you out of the show and out of the time, the way he talks, the way he acts, but it was a good time. Other things about Beckwourth is he had a biography also. And his biography also had some troubles. Some of the stuff that more people started to look at it is made up, which is an unfortunate thing, but it's back in that day and age before Wikipedia, before Ancestry.com, before a lot of other information sources that were available online. You couldn't just Google somebody and find out that what they said was wrong. I would say that any biography that you read of anyone born in the 18th or 19th centuries, you need to take all of their biographies with a grain of salt. Another thing is right towards the end of his life, Jim Beckwourth was working as a scout for the military in Colorado. I think it was a Colorado unit. He was involved in the Sand Creek Massacre. As a result of that, he was essentially blackballed from a number of tribes that were in the area of northern New Mexico and Colorado. Then you get to Bill Pickett. Bill Pickett played in the film, and I know I'm going to wreck his name against Edie Gathegi. Again, huge guess as to what it is, and again, my apologies for mangling his name. Bill Pickett in 1895 would have been 25 years old. The actor's age, 42. So it's just kind of a different little thing there that he ended up being in the film, because he wasn't a gunslinger. He wasn't a marksman that anybody knew of. He was a cowboy. He was a rodeo star. Bill Pickett invented bulldogging, which later on ended up turning into steer wrestling. Bill Pickett was all over the place, and just to kind of give an idea of what it was like being a black man in America during the first part of the 20th century, he would have to show up, and in order to compete in some rodeos, he would have to claim that he was Cherokee. in order to be able to compete because they wouldn't let Black Americans into the rodeos. So there's some huge stuff there. But I mean, just to show you how much of a star he was involved with the 101 Ranch Show. So he knew William F. Buffalo Bill Cody. He knew Will Rogers. He knew Tom Mix. He knew a lot of the luminaries of kind of what you would think of as early Wild West culture. I mean, it's really just amazing. He ended up passing away in Oklahoma, I think it was, in 1932. Oh, yeah, it was Ponca City. So, yeah, he was in Oklahoma when he passed away in 1932. So, but it really kind of ends up being an issue trying to get all of these people together in that time frame. And as I mentioned, Cathay Williams, I only found out just before I did this afternoon that the character of Cuffy, based on Cathay Williams, and she mentions her name as Cathay at one point, born in 1844, passed away in 1893, so she would have passed away just before this. She would have been 51 years old if she was actually in this. One of my favorite characters in the whole show, just how she did this, especially not only because you're showing people of color, but you're also showing non-binary people of color. And I think it was just an amazing pick. It was just an amazing casting of her as that character. I thought, really, I mean, just, again, showing the variety of people who were living in the West. It's not just a bunch of white guys riding around on horses shooting at each other. It's not women fawning over each other as either the housewife in the cabin or as a Miss Kitty at the saloon. There's a lot of things going on in this film in the way of social commentary that I really, really appreciate, and it really shows a depth of the film. So again, looking at their ages in 1895, and I was able to actually add Cuffy onto this. So we have Nat Love, 41, Stagecoach Mary, 63, Bass Reeves, 57, Jim Beckworth would have been dead, but almost 100. Bill Pickett, 25, Rufus Buck, 17, Cherokee Bill, 19, and Cuffy, 51. So you've got a wide variety of ages, a wide variety of people around the country. And honestly, when I look at this, I'm trying to figure out, okay, who could have actually been together in this place at this time? And in 1895, we already know we had Rufus Buck and Cherokee Bill in the same building for a number of months. Granted, they weren't going anywhere. Bass Reeves may have been in that building at the same time. He may have talked to Cherokee Bill or Rufus Buck. As far as I know, I don't think he came into contact with either one of them. Nat Love wouldn't have been anywhere around here. Stagecoach Mary wouldn't have been anywhere around here. Bill Pickett, doubtful. Cuffy would not have been anywhere around here. She wasn't in Oklahoma. But I mean, there's some ways this all could have played out. But I'll give the guy, I will give him, the director, the variance on this, because his whole idea here is to use these characters in a fictional West to tell a fictional story. And to me, the majority of his reason for doing this is to show that these people existed, to show that these people were there. These were real people who really existed. This might be in some sort of a fictional comic book type world where you can make anything happen. But honestly, there's a ton. If you're going to start picking at a movie for reasons like that, there's a whole lot easier films to go and yell at about having issues, history versus Hollywood. Some of my conclusions on this, I really enjoy the film. As you could tell, it was really just kind of a special thing. I enjoyed it. It's to me goes up in a category where I have films like let's see, what was it? What is it? I was talking with somebody earlier today about this with Kevin Costner and Danny Glover. Silverado, horrible movie when it comes to history. Horrible movie when it comes to, like, just, you've got guys carrying around Henry rifles in the West in the 1890s or so. But you've got a lot of stories. Like you tell this great story with these great characters trying to get just a Western story and a Western fable. And I think that works really well. And I think that's what James Samuel pulls off here. He does a very stylistic take on an American story, good guys versus bad guys. The good guys, they have to form their group. They come up against the bad guys. They've all got their differences, and they face off. I'm not going to go into any of the real surprises there at the end, but I think all in all, this story comes together in a way that I really appreciate, especially when you start to look at just kind of how it goes. I see William Lewis is on. I'm glad you were able to make it over to YouTube. Said he hasn't seen it yet. And I know this film, I've already heard from a couple of friends, this is not everybody's cup of tea. This is a film that you're either going to enjoy or you won't. And so it's one of those things that let me go ahead and drop this back out and get back to my office. This film is a film that, like I said, you're going to enjoy it or you won't enjoy it. It is, to me, I had a lot of fun watching it. I had and if anybody's watching right now and you have a question and you want to watch that you have about this, or even if you're watching this much after the fact, we monitor our YouTube channel. Feel free to ask questions at some point, and if we see it, we'll give you an answer. But this film it's one of those films that I think it's going to capture a lot of people's attention. It's going to help focus a lot of people's study and thought. It's not a Western for everybody. I know a ton of people who are going to hate, I know at least a couple of people who already hate this film, including an old friend and also a current coworker. And it's not the film for some people. And I get that. A lot of people don't want to go into a film and hear basically a lot of swagger and hip hop. And that's kind of one of the things that happens. But it's kind of, you watch this for the same reason that you watch a Tarantino movie. If you watch this for the same reason that you watch a spaghetti Western with Clint Eastwood, you get a very stylistic look at what is a non-traditional view of this particular subject. It's an action film that takes place in the West. There's lots of stuff that you wouldn't have seen in the Old West. You very definitely wouldn't have seen in a John Wayne film, or for that matter, in a Roy Rogers film, or just anything in between. But I think this is a great way to reinvent the Western. I think it's a great way to tell the story about these individuals whose stories need to be heard. They should be heard. I mean, there are some amazing tales out of the American West that are brand new to so many people. And I think the more that we get these stories out, the more people will better understand the history of our country, the history of our West. And especially when you start to get more news out about real characters like Bass Reeves, real characters like Rufus Buck and Cherokee Bill, real characters like Nat Love and Jim Beckworth and Bill Pickett. I mean, Stagecoach Mary. These are just some amazing people out of American history who just haven't had their moment. And so you get some people who are kind of interested in the subject who might gloss over a paragraph about this individual or that individual. But this, I hope, is going to allow some viewers who don't know these stories to jump in and start researching them and start to find out more information about these real people. If you watch the film and you don't like it, I will fully understand. It's not, like I said, it's not everybody's cup of tea. I enjoyed it and it's one of those things that from the get-go, he is telling people that, and I'm going to go back to the image where he shows this. Let me bring this up full screen. And again, the first two things you see in the film, while the events of this story are fictional, these people existed. And again, that to me, that's why he made this film. He came in, he told a Western, but when you get done watching this, he's teaching you through this entertainment that the history of the West, the history of America isn't cut and dried. I know a lot of people, there's a lot of discussions going on right now about whether over the last couple of years, whether you're talking about the oh, the, what was it, the, trying to remember now, was it the 1620 project? No, yeah, 1620 project. Between that, uh, people who are talking about critical race theory, people are talking about other types of education, and it's these huge arguments and these fights that are going on regarding how school kids and others are teaching their history. And I mean, that's exactly what this film is about. This is teaching that history. This is getting the word out there that these people existed, these people did live in America, and they had a different experience than what was held by people who look like me. And I will freely admit that I'm very much, that's just due to the nature of my birth and my ancestry. I led a different life than the nature of someone else who was had different ancestry in a different birth. And so I think that is really the huge thing that some people are going to be missing about this movie is the subtext is that people need to open their eyes and people need to recognize that there's more history, and just the more that we tell is not that we're trying to change history or we're trying to rewrite the past. We're just trying to write more about a broader past and a broader culture. So I think with that, I'm probably going to go ahead and get off of my soapbox that I've been on for the last minute or three. And so if you have a question about this, and I see that we've only got a couple of people here watching this. We're going to go ahead and we're probably going to be keeping these on YouTube in the future just because we know that YouTube is kind of where we need to start showing our videos. It's a little bit of a jump from where we used to be doing every week on Facebook, but that served its purpose for what we were doing. And I think going over to YouTube and allowing for a broader audience easier, I think we're looking at this is probably what's going to be happening. If at any time somebody's watching this, if you've got a question, go ahead and throw it in the comments and we will try to get back to you. Otherwise, if you've stayed through this, thank you very much for watching. Mr. Lewis, thank you for watching. And I hope you enjoy the film. And anybody who saw the film, I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've got any questions, by all means, feel free to give us a shout. And if you are in Fort Smith, Arkansas towards the end of 2022, come by the museum, say hey. And so we'll talk to you later. Again, hit our webpage, hit our Facebook page, get in contact with us if you want to find out what we're doing here at the museum and how we're telling the history of the United States Marshals. By all means, drop in. Thanks a lot, and you guys have a wonderful day.